If you're studying philosophy A-level or religious studies and ethics, subscribe. I'm covering the entire course on this channel. In this lecture, we're going to evaluate one of the most influential ethical theories in modern philosophy, utilitarianism. In previous lessons, we've explored the foundations of the theory through the work of Bentham and Mill, and we've looked at developments like the debate between act and rule utilitarianism. But philosophers don't just explain ethical theories, they also test them. They ask difficult questions. Does this theory actually work? Does it produce fair outcomes? Does it capture what we really think morality should be about? So in this lecture, we'll examine the strengths and weaknesses of utilitarianism, asking whether it's ultimately a convincing approach to moral decision making. And by the end, you should not only be able to explain utilitarianism, but also evaluate it critically, which is exactly what examiners expect at A-level. So let's recap. What is utilitarianism? Well, it contains the principle of utility. According to utilitarian thinkers, the morally right action is the one that produces the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And it's a form of consequentialism, which means the morality of an action depends on its consequences rather than the action itself. It's also teleological in nature, the telos meaning purpose. So it's about the outcomes. And Bentham, one of the key thinkers, described pleasure and pain as the two sovereign masters that govern human life. In other words, everything we do ultimately relates to seeking pleasure or avoiding suffering. And this means utilitarianism evaluates actions by asking a very simple question. Does this action increase happiness overall? If the answer is yes, the action is morally right. If it produces more suffering than happiness, then the action is morally wrong. And this is what makes utilitarianism one of the most straightforward and influential moral theories in modern philosophy. And one of the other key thinkers is John Stuart Mill. And these are the two founders, Bentham and Mill, that you must know about. So let's have a look then at Bentham and his hedonic calculus. Bentham believed that pleasure could be measured and compared. And to do this, he proposed something called the hedonic calculus, which essentially is a method for calculating happiness. Bentham suggested that when evaluating an action, we should consider factors like how intense the pleasure will be, how long-lasting it will be, how many people will it affect. And this might seem strange today, trying to measure happiness like a mathematical formula, but Bentham was deeply influenced by the scientific thinking of the Enlightenment. He believed that morality could be made systematic and rational, almost like a science. Interestingly, he even suggested that pushpin is as good as poetry if it produces the same amount of pleasure. Now, pushpin was a very simple pub game in the 18th century England, and Bentham used this example to argue that all pleasures should count equally. And this idea later became controversial, and that's why it was John Stuart Mill who tried to refine Bentham's theory. And so we have Mill's development of utilitarianism. He agreed with Bentham that happiness should be the goal of morality, but he thought his theory, Bentham's theory, was too simplistic. Bentham, you see, treated all pleasures as equal in quality, focusing only on the quantity. Whereas Mill, he argued that this reduces human beings to something like pleasure-seeking animals, a criticism sometimes called the swine objection. To solve this problem, Mill introduced the idea that some pleasures are higher in quality than others. Intellectual pleasures, such as reading, learning, appreciating art, engaging in philosophical thought, these are higher pleasures, they're superior. Far more than the lower pleasures, the basic physical pleasures like eating, drinking, or simple entertainment. These are lower pleasures. Mill famously wrote that it is better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. In other words, a thoughtful and reflective life may involve dissatisfaction, but it is still more valuable than a life focused only on simple pleasures. Well, let's now take a look at the strengths of utilitarianism. We need to get into the weighing up, the evaluating of this topic. Let's consider why many philosophers find it attractive. One of the major strengths is that utilitarianism focuses directly on well-being. Rather than emphasizing rigid rules or traditions, it asks a very practical question. What will make people's lives better? And another strength is the theory's impartiality. Bentham insisted that each person's happiness counts equally, and this idea supports principles of equality and has influenced modern ideas today about democracy and social justice. Utilitarianism is also flexible because it focuses on consequences. It can adapt to different situations rather than insisting the same rule must apply in every case. And finally, it's useful. Its reasoning has been very useful and influential in areas like public policy, healthcare ethics, and economics, where decision makers often try to maximize overall well-being. So these are the strengths. But there are also a number of serious criticisms that utilitarianism faces. And one problem is that predicting consequences is extremely difficult. We rarely know exactly how our actions will affect the future, and that makes utilitarian calculations rather uncertain. Another issue is the calculation problem. Bentham's hedonic calculus that we previously looked at assumes that happiness can be measured and compared, but human experiences of happiness are rather more complex and subjective than this unrealistic and reductive approach. How do you quantify or compare different people's happiness? Critics also argue that utilitarianism can justify unjust actions, in particular against minorities. If harming one individual increases happiness for many others, the theory may appear to permit that harm. And finally, utilitarianism can be morally demanding, expecting individuals to constantly sacrifice their own interests to maximize happiness for others. So where is the space for our personal projects, our loyalty, or our partiality? And so many critics say, psychologically, it's far too demanding and unrealistic. Well, let's illustrate the theory with some key examples. Philosophers often use thought experiments to illustrate how utilitarian reasoning works. For example, imagine a doctor with 5 patients who need an organ transplant. If one healthy person enters the hospital, could the doctor sacrifice that person to save 5 others? And from a strict utilitarian perspective, saving 5 lives might produce more happiness than saving 1. However, most people feel that killing an innocent person would still be morally wrong. Examples like this highlight the tension between maximizing happiness and protecting individual rights. And these thought experiments, like the ones highlighted here, help philosophers test whether utilitarian reasoning matches our moral intuitions. We can think about the NHS here. We can think about the scoring that is used to allocate healthcare resources to maximize overall well-being. That's utilitarian logic in public policy. We can think about the legalization of same-sex marriage. It increases happiness for many, and it doesn't seem to harm anyone in particular. And so for liberal law reform, utilitarianism has been used. But we sometimes will say the problem with these practical examples is the scapegoating of things. Punishing innocent people to prevent a riot could get justified by utility, and that seems unjust. And if only happiness matters, we should plug in. Most people's rejection of this challenges hedonism. And so the issue lies with, if happiness is the only goal that we have, we could live a life of hedonistic pleasure and disregard others. And so we have to ask the question, is utilitarianism ultimately convincing? Supporters will argue that the theory captures something very important about morality. The idea that our actions should promote human well-being and reduce suffering. But critics will argue, however, that focusing only on the consequences ignores other important moral values like justice, rights, and fairness. And because of this, many philosophers believe utilitarianism provides important insights but may not be sufficient as a complete moral theory. And here we can see in its favour, it's democratic, it's clear, it's a non-religious secular basis for ethics. It's compatible with modern day governments and human right thinking. And if you apply John Stuart Mill's version, it avoids the crude hedonism we just mentioned a minute ago. But scholars like Bernard Williams says that it undermines our integrity, it takes away our agent relative obligations, and rules says it fails to respect our individual rights and it ignores justice and duty and virtue. Now, most examiners will reward students who acknowledge its practical strengths and recognize the theoretical limitations. And I think that tension is something that would be very worthwhile talking about and discussing in any evaluative essays. The tension between its practical strengths and its theoretical limitations, especially when you're applying it to issues of justice and human rights. And so the debate continues today, and utilitarian thinking still plays a major role in discussions about global poverty, healthcare allocation, and environmental ethics as well. So how should you structure your A-level essay? For all A-level religious studies students and philosophy and ethics, these topics frequently appear in exam questions. So when writing an essay on utilitarianism, it's important to follow a clear structure. It's also worth noting few, if any, exam boards have ever given a clear structure for how to write your essays in exams. They're really just looking for the key ingredients. So it can be helpful, however, to have a structure. So let's explain, first of all, what you would do. You would look at the core principles of the theory, including Bentham's hedonic calculus and Mill's development of higher and lower pleasures. You would exposit these, unpack them. Then you would analyze the strengths of the theory, such as its focus on well-being and its commitment to equality. And then you would evaluate the weaknesses, including problems of calculation, prediction, justice, and moral demandedness. And there'll be lots of examples in strong essays, references to key philosophers, and a clear evaluation, with a convincing conclusion as to whether or not utilitarianism is itself convincing or not. So you're going to engage with scholars by name: Bentham, Mill, Williams, Rawls, Mackey, etc. Use precise terminology: teleological, consequentialist, hedonic calculus, utility, and reach a clear, justified conclusion. Avoid listing things without analysing them. And so finally, I've given you a key terminology checklist here that you should understand for the exam and be comfortable explaining key terms and applying them. Hedonic calculus Bentham's 7 criteria for measuring pleasure and pain quantitatively. There's a separate video I've created just on this. Higher and lower pleasures, Mill's qualitative distinction between intellectual and bodily satisfactions. I've also created a separate video on rule utilitarianism with act and comparing them. Act utilitarianism. Each act is judged independently by its likely utility. This is Bentham's approach. Rule utilitarianism, following the rules that, if generally observed, maximize overall utility. And Mill refined Bentham's theory with this. Teleological, consequentialist. The purpose. Morality determined by ends, outcomes, not intrinsic rightness of the act itself. And the principle of utility, to describe the greatest happiness for the greatest number. This is the foundational utilitarian standard. And these 4 concepts form the foundation of utilitarian ethics and frequently appear in exam questions. Being able to explain them clearly will help you demonstrate strong philosophical understanding and analytical ability. And a final exam tip: dropping precise terminology into your argument, not just in the introduction of an essay, signals that what might be level 5 or AO1 and AO2 evaluative skills to examiners, depending on the exam board's mark schemes.